Hi, I'm Brian.
And I'm Joyce.
And we're standing in Ferson Creek Park, nearby the scenic Fox River and alongside Route 31 in St. Charles, Kane County, Illinois. And just about 1,000 feet to the south of us, and just to the west of the road, lies a prehistoric Native American site, sometimes referred to as the Allen site, sometimes referred to as the Wildrose Mound site, and sometimes referred to as the Ferson Mound site, which is what we'll refer to it as during this series.
This site was formerly a set of 3 conical Native American burial mounds, set atop a narrow ridge along the riverbank running north to south. Hundreds of years ago, seasonal Native American settlements dotted along this same riverbank, and the inhabitants of those settlements honored their dead in burial mounds along the Fox River, set in areas of prominence to anyone traveling along the river by canoe or on foot.
In this series of videos, we'll explore the history of this site, what ultimately became of it, and what it tells us about the inhabitants who lived here long before us.
We hope you enjoy these videos. Please like and subscribe and share the videos. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below. The primary sources for this video series include the unpublished paper, Preliminary Report, The Allen Site, St. Charles, Illinois, by William Clough, Charles O. Ellenbaum, and John Ferson, College of DuPage.
Contemporary newspaper and newsletter articles from the Chicago Tribune, the College of DuPage Courier, the St. Charles Chronicle, and the Teletype News.
Conversations with Peter Geraci, archaeologist at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee.
Conversations with Charles Ellenbaum, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the College of DuPage, Glen Ellen, Illinois.
Conversations with Brian Barty, a vocational archaeologist and paraeducator at Lyons Township High School.
The St. Charles History Museum, St. Charles, Illinois.
U.S. Census Information.
U.S. Bureau of Land Management Records.
Kane County, Illinois, Plat Maps and Vital Records.
The year was 1877. In the U.S. Midwest, the summer season was ebbing away, with fair weather and moderate temperatures in abundance. But the times were not good. The U.S. economy was in poor shape, being in the depths of the Long Depression, a recession that had started 4 years earlier, triggered by the Panic of 1873, and was further crippled by the recent chaos and violence of the Great Railroad Strike, which caused major disruptions in the transportation of both freight and people.
The place was the county seat of Kane County, Illinois, in the village of Geneva, along the Fox River. Here a group of antiquities-minded citizens passed the pleasant summer evening discussing some of the mounds that line the Fox River Valley, atop ridges along its east and west embankments. At the time, there were dozens of such earthworks lining both sides of the Fox River, from Elgin in the north to at least as far south as Batavia. What mysteries did these mounds contain? Which of the Native American tribes had built them, and for what reason?
Perhaps their conversation had turned to this topic, as Native Americans, though long removed from Illinois, had been very much in the news in recent months. It was during the final throes of the Native American resistance, being played out on the enormous canvas of the U.S. Central Plains and Mountain States, and brought to people's porches and parlors via the newspapers, the internet and social media of the day. Only the year before, Crazy Horse and the Oglala Sioux had crushed General George Custer at the Little Bighorn, far to the west in Montana. In January, Crazy Horse's warriors fought their last battle with the U.S. cavalry at the Battle of Wolf Mountain, before, starving and haggard, surrendered to U.S. troops in Nebraska just a few months later in May. At the same time, Chief Sitting Bull led his people out of the U.S. and into Canada to avoid the constant harassment of the U.S. cavalry. Meanwhile, further west, the Nez Perce tribe battled the U.S. cavalry in Idaho and Montana.
Back in the Geneva Lyceum, the amateur antiquarians talked with some excitement into the evening, as a few of them had recently traveled to Fox Lake, 40 miles to the north at the head of the Fox River, for a bit of a summer vacation. While there, they did some ad hoc exploring and pot hunting into one of the local mounds, discovering a human skull and a few large bones, although these were in poor condition. This mound was similar in size and shape to many seen along the Fox River Valley to the south, and they conjectured that the local mounds by St. Charles, Geneva, and southward would also contain burials and other artifacts.
They also knew that the Fox Valley mounds were different than those reported elsewhere. They realized that they were not ceremonial platform mounds, seen in places such as Cahokia, Illinois, as they were simply too small, as well as not being shaped as a platform. They also knew that these mounds differed in being larger and taller than the effigy or symbolic or emblematic mounds as they called them, the type of mounds seen from Ohio through Wisconsin, often in the shape of an animal such as a bear or serpent or other abstract shapes. But such excitement arose from their discussions that by the close of the evening they had organized a more formal expedition, targeting a mound group known to them, situated a few miles north of Geneva, in the locality of St. Charles, Illinois.
And so in the final weeks of August 1877, this group of antiquarians trekked north to nearby St. Charles, and then a further mile north along the west bank of the Fox River to the farm of John Ferson, along the Elgin Road, as it was called then. Today, it's known as Illinois Route 31. The group included Dr. Francis Homer Blackman, a 30-year-old physician, who likely lent his expertise to identifying human skeletal remains, and was from Geneva. Pinderfield Ward, a 54-year-old proprietor of a land office and former Kane County clerk, also from Geneva. Pearl DeWolf Hoyt, a 34-year-old drugstore clerk and sometimes artist, from Geneva. George Turner, a 34-year-old treasurer of a local manufacturing firm, from Geneva. And Henry Pierce, a 43-year-old secretary of a local manufacturing company, also from Geneva. They were joined by Samuel Fessenden Clark, a 27-year-old naturalist, originally from Geneva, but now a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. He was likely in town for the summer break, visiting his mother Polly and his sister Mary. His presence likely ensured that the excavation used a more scientific approach.
John Hall Ferson was the 31-year-old farmer who owned the property containing the mound group, and was the son of James Ferson of Connecticut and Mary Stowe Hall of Vermont. He had lived on the property all of his life, as his parents had been among the first settlers in the area, his father obtaining a land patent on the property in March of 1843. James Ferson passed away in 1873, and young John inherited this portion of his land along the Fox River. A year after his father's death in 1874, John Ferson married Addie Veeder, originally of New York.
On John Ferson's farm, the antiquarians encountered 3 mounds just to the west of the Elgin Road, running in a straight line north to south. 2 large round or oval mounds, about 30 feet by 40 feet in diameter and 4 to 5 feet high, spaced about 50 feet apart. And then a third smaller mound, about 15 feet in diameter, 3 feet high, and 200 feet further north. No trees grew atop any of the 3 mounds at this time. Both the mounds and the roadway were situated on a fairly narrow ridge that paralleled the Fox River below. Ferson's Creek, as it was called, meandered through Ferson's property from the west, feeding into the Fox River hundreds of feet north of the mound group. From the north and west, the land sloped upwards from this creek bed to the mound ridge. On the other side of the ridge to the east, the land fell away about 300 feet towards the Fox River.
The excavation party selected the southernmost mound as the focus of their investigation, which was noted to already have a few shallow pits from earlier pot hunting attempts. They started a first large trench in the northwest quadrant of the mound. As they worked their way towards the center, after about 5 feet in, they came upon human remains about 2.5 feet below the mound surface, unearthing a scapula, a humerus, and a portion of a clavicle, which they deemed to belong to a child about the age of 12 years. They continued to dig, going down to the original ground surface beneath the mound, which they reckoned by comparing soils, a rough stratigraphy, noting that the mound soil consisted of light stone-free earth, while the original ground surface was a blackish loam. They conjectured that the mound was constructed from alluvial soils from the lowlands immediately to the west of the ridge, where the mounds lay, along the area prone to flooding from Ferson Creek.
Towards the center of the mound, approximately 3 feet below the surface, they noted a significant deposit of charcoal, white ash, and charred earth that they interpreted to be a great and sustained fire that had burned over much of an earlier mound surface. At about this same level, they found several pieces of pottery, dark brown in color, and of coarse fabric or material that they conjectured to be a fragment of an earthenware jug.
As they worked their way down in the center of the mound, they noted that the original ground surface had been removed, creating a depression beneath the mound's center. About a foot below the original ground surface, they excavated a complete human skeleton, of great size, in excellent condition, and with, quote, magnificent cranial development, which the antiquarians greatly admired.
The dig then moved to the northeast quadrant of the mound, where they started a second trench, and where at about 4 feet below the surface, the excavation yielded 3 more human skeletons, laying side by side, facing inwards towards the center, and forming something akin to an arc of a circle. Based on the original description, we do not know whether these burials were above or below the original ground surface.
All totaled, the excavation company had uncovered at least 5 nearly complete human skeletons, as well as an abundance of disarticulated bones from up to 10 individuals, mostly thigh bones or femurs, tibiae, fibulae, humeri, radii, ribs, vertebrae, pelvis, and scapulae. Much of the loose or disarticulated bones appeared to have been from burials higher up in the soil sequence, closer to the top of the mound. The condition of these bones suggested to the antiquarians that the remains of these later added individuals had been reduced to bones via a process of excarnation prior to burial in the mound. They also noted that none of these disarticulated bones appeared to have been exposed to fire, meaning that these later burials did not include cremation. Finds near the surface of the mound also included bone needles, pieces of flint, imperfect projectile points, deer bones, as well as some shells.
The finds in this mound generated much excitement among the antiquarians, so much so that they decided to create an archaeological society of Kane County, with the goal of exploring further mounds in the area, as they had already noted the presence of many other mounds along the Fox River, from Elgin to Batavia. And they knew of at least 5 similar mounds between Geneva and St. Charles on the east side of the Fox River. And there were also several additional mounds on the west side of the river, north of Ferson's farm, extending up towards Elgin.
As to the second large mound of the Ferson Mound group, the middle mound, Farmer Ferson indicated that he already had plans to cart it away and plow it under in early autumn of 1877, although subsequent events suggest he never took up the task. And nothing more was said of the fate of the smaller and northernmost mound of the grouping.
It is uncertain what ultimately became of the many artifacts, pottery, lithics, and human remains found in the mound that was excavated, the southernmost Ferson Mound. But it was recorded that at least some of the best specimens, including skulls, were packed up and sent to William Bross, who was at that time the president of the Chicago Historical Society, as well as a Chicago alderman, for him to examine in more detail. The Chicago Historical Society was still in the process of rebuilding after the 1871 Great Chicago Fire and another subsequent fire that had destroyed much of its collections.
Although this 1877 excavation could indeed be considered a desecration, having dug into human burials without any sort of permission or care for the original inhabitants of the land. For the time period, the late 19th century, it was somewhat enlightened. Many of these mounds, from the earliest times of European settlers invading the land, were simply plowed under, carted away, or built upon, with little concern or care as to their contents. But ironically, just as European settlers had by this time pushed Native Americans into some of the least livable and least desirable pieces of land on the continent, and having nearly wiped them from the face of the earth, the settled communities, particularly in the East and Midwest, who no longer saw them as a threat, were becoming increasingly interested in Native Americans and their ancestors as a people, including the earthworks and cultural artifacts that they had left behind.
Some of the earlier antiquarians of the late 18th and early 19th century had reckoned that Native Americans were not sufficiently sophisticated and intelligent enough to have created the earthworks found throughout the continent. And so they suggested that the mound builders were instead some former grand civilization long since vanished, and then replaced by the cruder Native American peoples. Of course, this view was entirely wrong, for so many different reasons and on many different levels. By the time of this dig in the late 1870s, there was growing recognition that the immediate ancestors of the various Native American tribes encountered during the relentless expansion of European settlement had in fact been the mound builders, with rich cultural traditions linking back through hundreds and even thousands of years.
From an archaeological perspective, this antiquarian party conducted a somewhat sophisticated excavation for its time, making notes of the dimensions and location of the earthworks, making note of soil stratigraphies, noting the location of artifacts and burials within the mound, and noting the types of burials, whether inhumation, excarnation, or cremation. It is unfortunate that no report resulted from this dig, as we might expect in a modern archaeological investigation. But we are fortunate to have had a rather extensive Chicago Tribune newspaper article written on the 5th of September 1877, describing the affair on what was likely to have been a slow news day in Chicago. However, it is worth noting that the same day that this article was written for the Chicago Tribune, that Crazy Horse, one of the last great Native American warrior chiefs and visionaries, was bayoneted and killed by a guard while in a prison camp far to the west in Nebraska.
In our next episode, we'll investigate the subsequent excavations of this site, which were to be almost 100 years later by a local college, bringing new finds to the surface, as well as raising the awareness and consciousness of the community.